Hi, I'm the Space Quest historian. Look, my friend Paul made a game. Listen, before you shut this video off, let me just say, I'll make this worth your while, okay? Yes, he's a friend of mine, and yes, he even paid me to play his game and make a video about it. Look, it's one of my Patreon tiers, anyone can do it. So, this isn't going to be an objective, level-headed review, even though that is, of course, my forte. I am obviously going to be a bit biased because he's a friend and he paid me to do it, and for that same reason, I'd feel a bit weird if I just gave it a bashing, so here's what we're going to do, okay? I'm going to show you his game, and then I'll make it worth your while by listing out 5 things that I think he does well that I also think other game developers really should be taking notes on, okay? Because this is Paul's first game, and yeah, I keep saying Paul like you know who it is. His name's Paul Corman. He hangs out on this Facebook group called the Classic Gamers Guild. They're a really lovely bunch of people, and it's not strictly a solo effort. He does have another guy helping him out with the writing. His name is Rick Highbury, but Paul does most of the grunt work. He does the art and the programming, and he's gonna do the music too, and half of the writing. So, okay, I'll bet you're looking at this thinking either one of two things. Is my screen fucking up? Or are those just extra chunky pixels? And it's the latter. Although if they're translucent green and muttering soft instructions on how to murder your parents at you, it is possible that your screen is fucked up, and also you may want to look into some heavy-duty psychiatric care. So, this extra chunky pixel style, you've probably seen this before in games like Darkside Detective or The Last Door or Inspector Waffles. There's just something in vogue these days about big fuck-off Atari 2600-sized pixel art. I can't say I'm a huge fan of it personally, but there is something to be said for getting the most out of your constraints. And having this few pixels to work with means you have to work extra hard setting the mood and picking the right colors and making sure everything is recognizable and still readable to the eye. And I've seen some criticize this kind of art style as lazy, and that simply doesn't track, because working with less pixels doesn't equal laziness. In fact, sometimes it can be quite the opposite. The less you have to work with, the more care and attention you have to put in to make sure that people aren't going to go, what the hell's that supposed to be? And Paul does a pretty good job of that. I mean, it's not the best looking game of this type that I've seen. That distinction would go to Darkside Detective, which frankly just performs miracles with this art style, but Paul does have a great sense of color, his objects are recognizable for what they are, and he has some fairly decent animations, like here where our protagonist picks up a flaming log and burns to death. Yeah, we should probably talk real quick about what kind of game this is. And to do that, I'm afraid I'm going to have to do a lot of preempting, because this game has a few hurdles that it needs to clear in terms of setting itself apart from other games out there, and if I'm being honest, it's gonna be an uphill battle. For starters, the premise shares a lot in common with fellow chunky pixel comedy horror game Darkside Detective. You have a guy, this guy's name is Oliver Cobblestone, who's out solving paranormal happenings, and he has a quirky sidekick called Engelbert Picklebender. Unlike Darkside though, he's not a member of law enforcement, and his sidekick is a dead person, so there is a subtle distinction there. But that means it's now sharing something in common with another paranormal investigation adventure game series, this time Wadget Eye's Blackwell series, which also has a plucky everyday person fiddling with supernatural shit who has a ghost for a sidekick. But unlike the protagonist Rosa in Blackwell, Oliver isn't actually psychic, and he can't actually see any other ghosts other than Engelbert. In fact, he's a complete fraud who pretends to do exorcisms with black lights and bits of chalk, but what's actually happening is Engelbert just convinces the other ghosts to go away and haunt someplace else. Which means the game is now sharing something in common with a Peter Jackson movie from 1996, where Michael J. Fox pretends to be an exorcist but really just has 2 ghost buddies who go in and mess shit up for people. You see what I mean? This game has a lot going for it if you give it a chance, and I'll get into that in just a moment, but it's got this uphill battle of haven't I seen this before to overcome. It's something I hope Paul and Rick will somehow work out how to explain to people before they click off the Steam page because they think it's just a rehash of stuff that's already out there. Because what this game does have going for it is some of the best dialogue I've ever read. Darkside Detective has brilliant and funny dialogue too, but it's a different sort of funny. Phantom Fellow's dialogue leans heavily on subtle absurdities, where characters don't speak like normal human beings, but in the sort of way you wish people would speak. Kinda how like people in Kevin Smith movies are always exceptionally eloquent, or people in Joss Whedon's shows always have this witty comeback to everything. You kinda wish people would talk like that, but in reality they don't. In Phantom Fellows, you get these fantastic descriptions like, this block of wood seems to have a complex storage system built into it when you're looking at a normal set of drawers, or this lamp that's described as a super tiny electric sun, or my favorite Zoe the scientist here describing her job as confirming that things that should not work do not. But the best thing about the writing is the frequent running gags that are both absurd and pay off really well. Instead of just being a string of gags and one-liners, the writing frequently makes callbacks to itself. There's a whole bit that runs through day 2 about going barefoot. Oliver hates people who go barefoot for some reason, and it pays off brilliantly at the end when he's forced to take off his shoes, and then Engelbert bullshits him into thinking the shoes are gone forever. There's also a repeated gag where Engelbert has an absolutely pointless supernatural power. He can predict when a phone will ring just moments before it does. And at one point, the two of them are outside and Engelbert yells, "Stop! The phone is about to ring!" And Oliver goes, "Whose? Ours or the client's?" Which Engelbert doesn't know, and Oliver then points out astutely that it doesn't matter because it's absolutely useless information either way. Little touches like that are what sold me completely on the writing. It's funny without trying too hard to be funny, but more importantly, it's also repeatedly self-referential. It's not the same as repeating the same joke 5,000 times. It's more like applying the same setup to a joke to 5,000 different situations and letting it play out differently each time. And that familiarity has the wonderful side effect of making the player feel like they're getting to know the characters through those jokes, instead of the dialogue just being a long list of situational puns and wisecracks. Oh hey, I promised this would be a top 5, didn't I? Well, that was number 1. The writing is funny, and not just funny haha, but honestly really funny, and in a different way than you're used to games being funny. So, there. Number 2 is that the writing is also concise. Game writers really struggle with this a lot, and I'm no angel when it comes to this shit either. I did an Adventure Jam game once where it's just murder by text box. Phantom Fellows keeps things short and sweet. Lines rarely have more than one sentence in them, and they're short and snappy, and this is absolutely the way to do it. Number 3 is the odd and interesting way the game handles character building. The game starts out in medias res, Oliver is out on a job, and you're not even told what his name is other than Mr. Cobblestone, and within a minute of talking to the client, you've already got a complete lowdown on what they're here to do, the relationship they have with each other, and what their actual game plan is. And later you go back to Oliver's apartment and it's immediately clear that he's living on his own, doesn't take very good care of himself, and is a bit of a weird fellow. For instance, he gives the moths living in his light fixtures names, even though they're dead. And he has this weird phrase about pageantry that he keeps using as a pickup line, and you get the sense that he fully knows that this is a weird thing to say, but he keeps using it in hopes of one day finding a woman that actually responds favorably to it, which, yeah, spoiler, Zoe here does, and within minutes of talking to her, she says her body is producing excess dopamine from being around him, and they immediately go back to his place to have sex, which again is not at all how human interaction works, but it's so unrealistic it's actually funny. And it's even more funny when we later learn that Engelbert never leaves the room and in fact maintains eye contact with Oliver during the entire act. So I'm not saying Oliver is a particularly deep person, nor that he has any outstanding characteristics that make him particularly interesting. I'm just saying that the way we learn about his character is done in an interesting way. We're not told explicitly what kind of person he is, which is what I see a lot of games do, and if they're really lazy, they'll even have the character describe themselves in a voiceover, but Phantom Fellows doesn't do any of that. Now you can argue that this makes Oliver a flat and two-dimensional character, and I would actually agree with that. For the duration of the demo I played, we're never told why he does what he does, only how he came to be in the position he's in. But I have a feeling the full game is going to drip feed us more character insights, because that certainly seems to be how it's building up so far. Number 4 is clearly defined goals. You're never at a loss about what your objective is. You're never at a loss wandering around in circles looking for something to do. The game is quite rigorously structured. It's even divided into chapters, or days in this case. This does mean that it's a very linear game, and as the player, you're not given a lot of freedom to explore Oliver's world. In fact, the game essentially boxes you into a set location for each of the days, and sometimes boxes you in even further to a single screen, and won't let you leave until you've done something. So it is very railroaded, and it feels very episodic. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, that's just a matter of preference. I mean, Darkside Detective does the same thing. However, it also means that if you get stuck, you will find yourself wandering around the same few screens over and over again. And owing to the game's rather surreal and absurd humor, you also have to sort of adjust your mode of thinking to a world of cartoon logic. Things in Phantom Fellows don't behave the way they do in the normal world. And I did get stuck constructing the straw replica of a cowboy ghost because I couldn't figure out what the game expected me to do with it. And apparently the answer was to set it on fire, then carry it back to a barn and hang it off a wooden rafter, which somehow miraculously doesn't catch fire. I don't know, it wasn't terribly obvious, and it felt like the game was a couple of steps ahead of me. It's one of those things where if you're doing absurdist humor, you really have to make sure the player is along for the ride and understands the rules of the world. And if those rules are loose and poorly defined, then you really have to go out of your way to show the player that if you do this, then this will happen, because the player can no longer rely on their intuition about the real world in a game where real world rules no longer apply. Which brings me to number 5 of things that the game does really well, and that's the unexpected. Here, I'll show you. You're at this farm. At one point, you're told to go get a lighter. So you go back to the front door and knock. The farmer yells off screen at his daughter to go answer the door, and then this happens. Bet you didn't expect that would happen. I certainly didn't. I like a game that takes chances like this and isn't afraid to do something unexpected. And what I really like is a game that takes a location that you're familiar with, like this front door scene that you've been to a million times, and then does something completely outrageous to it and then sticks with it. Because when you come back to the screen later, the window is all boarded up. Those are nice touches, and it keeps you on your toes because you're waiting to see what else this game might throw at you. Some games have really static environments. A gag like this exploding window thing shows that Phantom Fellows isn't afraid to completely mess shit up. So, anyway, that's it, really. Yes, this video was technically bought and paid for by the developer of the game, and yes, the developer is a friend of mine, so clearly this isn't an objective review or anything, but I didn't say anything I didn't mean, and Paul didn't fact-check or see the script before I did this. He didn't give me a bullet point list of things to talk about. He just gave me $50, a quick description of the game, and said make a video. So that's what I did. And you can too. Look, here's the Patreon tier that says I'll make a video about your game. It doesn't even have to be your game. It could be any game you want, as long as I get to make the video on my own terms, which is what this was. So, thank you so much for watching. I'm the Space Quest Historian, and I'll see you around the Chrono Stream. Bye!